units with the rent capped at, say, $17.10?
No.
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 So that bears no resemblance
No.
to
No.
what the rent could be on these affordable units.
Well, it's just really a guide. We're just trying to give an idea of what we're talking about when we say a low-income unit. That's the range of rent. If the unit were to be an actual deed-restricted affordable unit, then there would be restrictions on the income. But we're generally talking about housing types. So when we're looking at different housing types, like an accessory dwelling unit, the city looks at where that falls in this range of rent to be able to count that unit against an income group. So the city has done a lot of work to survey accessory dwelling units, as an example, in the city, and see where they fall, to which income categories they're meeting, and they do that by comparing the actual rent on that unit to this range of affordable rents.
Okay.
But basically, you're going to be focusing on housing types and density, not the specific rents or sales prices. That's not, you don't, what you're doing is creating the possibility that you can, the housing can be developed in the community that would theoretically fall into those categories, but you're not required, you're not zoning for particular housing costs.
So we could, to clarify, we could have a deed restricted property, but the rent could be $4,000 a month?
No. So if there's a vacant piece of land, all the city has to ensure is that it's zoned at that 20 units per acre, that density threshold.
Okay.
And in HCD's mind, the theory is that if you have that density, then an affordable housing developer could come in and build housing for affordable units because it could pencil out at that density. So it's just a guide, but by the city making a site available at 20 units per acre doesn't guarantee that the rents are going to be affordable, because you could have a market rate developer come in and build high density luxury condos on that property.
That's my point.
So there's, the city can't say that that property must be developed for affordable housing. And the city's not required to do that.
Well, unless we have an affordable housing overlay on that could carry some restrictions.
Restrictions or incentives for that.
To overcome that, most communities have what they call an inclusionary standard, that if you build over a certain number of units, a set percentage has to be at certain deed restricted, they have to be deed restricted, renting or selling at certain income level rates.
And that's one of the options that we have that we're not considering at this point. The state does not give us credit for units that are created via an inclusionary requirement, but that does not mean that we won't be adding such a policy or regulation in the future.
Right. I mean, I think Sausalito would be definitely focused on inclusionary to ensure that some of those units remain affordable. I have a real quick question on the slide previous to this one. Something I didn't understand, slide 16. Yeah. You have only moderate units considered, unless I misunderstand, on these undeveloped or vacant sites. Why, when if housing was built on those undeveloped sites, why wouldn't some of those units be in the low to moderate income range?
Are you talking about the capacity on vacant and underdeveloped sites?
We have zeros for all those sites.
It's because under the existing zoning, the city could really only accommodate single-family homes on these sites. Because, Lily, do you want to talk?
Unless the density was changed on those sites.
Correct.
Correct.
And
that's one of the strategies.
there are some slightly higher density sites, but because of the size of the parcels, and that's pretty common in Sausalito to have these really small parcels, you couldn't fit more than a single family home.
This chart is based on existing zoning.
This is based on the existing zoning
No new initiatives.
on the books.
Okay, thank you.
Question?
I'm just still confused with your question. So if, let's say, the fire station is rezoned and, for multi-density and to meet this requirement now, and a builder comes in and doesn't do low cost, aren't we gonna face this again?
Yeah, so.
I mean, I don't understand. You do the rezoning and someone builds it out that's with no requirements for low-cost housing.
If that site has what well, I think can you ask that question again after we've gone through the presentation? Any other questions on the regional housing needs allocation process? John?
I just want to follow up on the question of the woman, the yellow shirt here. I mean, you said that we're stuck within the boundaries of Sausalito, and that's true regarding the response. But let's face it, 16% of our allocation is a result of our sphere of influence, which includes Marin City and the Gate 5 area. So in a full disclosure, is there 64 units that come not from Sausalito, but come from our sphere of influence. And yet we're not allowed to use that sphere of influence to consider sites. Is that correct? I've got the calculations here for you.
Staff's understanding is our numbers that were assigned to us by ABAG are do not take into account the sphere.
Well, in 2007, 2014, you're correct. In 1999 and 2006.
I think we may be blending here the ABAG projections, their forecast document, which does at times take into account spheres of influence, and there's a distinction between the sphere and corporate city limits, but the RENA allocation process does not take in, corporate.
This document is dated final official release March 15, 2001, and it shows 143 for Sausalito and an unincorporated sphere of influence need of 64.
We can take a look at that, John. I appreciate it.
Happy to.
I have a comment on that.
I think we're going to try to, this is a public, maintain the questions for the public.
Page 5 on the blue.
Council members can, we're going to ask the council to hold their questions. And the task force asks that the council members hold their questions to the end of the process.
And I just have one suggestion, maybe. I'll stand there. As to anything that was submitted today and used as a discussion point, staff has no way of answering that. And so I think it's not going to be constructive to be asking questions off a piece of paper that neither staff nor the consultants have had an opportunity to look at. Now, if they have, then that's another thing. But I don't know where those numbers are.
Other questions from the public?
I need to respond to what Stan said.
No, that task force, the task force asked that the council members would hold their questions until the end of the presentation.
And just for your information, Stan Bear is the chairperson of the Housing Task Force.
Any other questions from the public?
Okay, I'm from the public. One question for slide 17, just out of curiosity, you were saying that we would be ineligible for state housing funds and infrastructure funds. Does the city of Sausalito obtain any funding under any of those programs today?
Not at this point, because we are not eligible, because we do not have a certified housing element.
Right, but basically the point is, we don't collect the funds anyway today.
We do not apply because we're not eligible.
Okay. Okay, I just want to clarify.
It's a policy question. If we were eligible, would we want to apply? That's the follow-up question. But we can't even apply if we wanted to.
Okay.
Chair, you pointed where the CDBG funds are allocated to Sausalito currently and have been for years. They fund.
Well, that's because we're in Newman County, and it's part of because we are a member of the county consortium on that. So can we continue on with the presentation?
Yeah, so the next part of the presentation is on the strategies to meet the RENA. So Larry went through the regional housing needs allocation and compared that to units built to date and then the capacity on existing vacant land under the current zoning. And just by using that traditional approach, the the city doesn't quite meet the regional housing needs allocation, and there is a remaining need. So the city is looking at a lot of different strategies to how to meet that remaining need. And Sausalito it's a unique place with unique housing types. So there are a lot of different strategies and a lot of different ways that the city is hoping to get there with that number. So after accounting for the units that were built and the capacity on existing vacant land under the existing zoning, there's still a remaining need of that 189 units. So I'm going to talk about 6 different strategies that the city is considering for how that remaining need might be met for the city. So the first strategy is to adopt an accessory dwelling unit regulations to be able to count capacity for future accessory dwelling units that don't already exist in the city. The second strategy that I'll discuss is an accessory dwelling unit amnesty program that would allow the city to count some existing accessory dwelling units that already exist in the city, but because of a city ordinance aren't technically legally permitted. So an amnesty program would allow some of these illegal accessory dwelling units to be counted against the city's affordable housing stock. The third strategy that I'll talk about is it's very similar to the ADU amnesty program, and it's counting existing undocumented liveaboards that already exist here in the city. The fourth strategy would be to provide incentives for future affordable liveaboards. And the fifth strategy I'll talk about is potentially rezoning some existing residential and mixed-use sites to allow for higher density residential. And then the last strategy is to rezone some non-residential land to allow residential. So these are 6 different strategies under consideration. And within each strategy, the city's looking at a light, a medium, and a heavy approach. And what that means, a light approach would be less aggressive policies, so a lower level of commitment by the city to make a policy change for that particular strategy. And this would be fewer incentives to encourage that strategy and some stricter regulations that might make it difficult to build those types of housing units. And then compared to the heavy approach, where the city would be required to have more aggressive policies, commit more to that particular strategy, have more incentives, and have lesser regulations on that type of housing. We've also, based on our experience as consultants, provided some input on sort of ranking the strategies and how we see how easy it would be for the city to implement it administratively, how much work would it require of city staff, compared to how difficult it might be to sell that idea to HCD, based on, because a lot of these strategies are unique to Sausalito, it'll require some additional work by the city to document and prove that that's a realistic strategy for the city. So a good thing to remember is just because the city proposes it as a strategy doesn't mean that the state will necessarily accept that as an adequate strategy for the city. So the first strategy is counting capacity for future accessory dwelling units. And what an accessory dwelling unit is, sometimes called a second unit or a granny flat. These are smaller units that are built on a parcel that already has an existing home. And they can provide more affordable housing and rental housing within a single family neighborhood where the housing costs are usually a bit higher. And housing element law allows jurisdictions to count the capacity for future accessory dwelling units against the RHNA. It's written into the law. You can count these accessory dwelling units, the capacity for future. And that capacity that you estimate has to be based on 3 things. It has to be based on your past development trends, your community need for these accessory dwelling units, and the resources and incentives that you provide to encourage accessory dwelling units to be built in your community. And as part of the Marin Housing Workbook, there was an accessory dwelling unit affordability study that showed that in Marin County, about 90% of these existing accessory dwelling units are serving the lower income needs of the Marin County area. So 30% of accessory dwelling units are serving